seekers currently arriving on its border with Mexico. Thousands of them are children travelling by themselves. I know you have a take on this. You can join our show, be part of the discussion by jumping on YouTube and into the comment section, and you too can be in the stream.
Latin American migrants typically come to the US looking for opportunity, looking for prospects. The migration flow that we are seeing from Central America today is different. It's desperate migration. For many of these migrants, it's a matter of life or death. The United States should increase its aid to Central American countries to target the root causes of this migration, which includes not just poverty, but violence in all its forms and corruption, including government corruption and impunity.
That's just one take on the immigration situation in the United States. You're about to hear three more. Camila, Kenji, Rachel, really good to have you. Thanks for being in the stream. Camila, tell everybody who you are, what you do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Camila Alvarez. I'm the legal director at the Central American Resource Center, or CARECEN, in Los Angeles, California. We are a community-based organization that has two focuses, organizing and legal. On our community-based organizing, we do organizing work around immigrants' rights, and on the legal side, we do pretty much any humanitarian-based, family-based, removal defense type direct legal services with immigrants.
Good to have you, Camila. Kenji, nice to see you. Tell the world what you do.
Thanks, Femi. My name's Kenji Kazuka. I'm an attorney and researcher with Human Rights First, and my research focuses on the effects of U.S. policy on asylum seekers and other people seeking protection in the United States, and we advocate for the United States to uphold its domestic laws and its international treaty commitments to refugees.
Oh, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. And Rachel, finally, welcome to the show. What do we need to know about you?
Thanks for having me. My name is Rachel Schmidtke. I'm the advocate for Latin America at Refugees International. We're a DC-based organization, and we advocate for life-saving assistance and protection for displaced people, and I focus predominantly on Central America and Mexico.
Yes, I want to show you, first of all, a quote that I saw. This is from the Department of Homeland Security, and I want to share that with you and get your response from the situation that the US is in right now. So let's have a look at this. As noted by the President in his executive order, securing our borders does not require us to ignore the humanity of those who seek to cross them. We are both a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. It feels almost like this is really difficult. On the one hand, we want to acknowledge our history as a nation of immigrants. On the other hand, there are thousands of people on the US border and we don't have a plan for them. Rachel, what did this say to you when you saw this? How does that help us understand what is happening right now?
I agree that I think the United States, we have the capacity to manage this situation. I think that we have the resources, and I think that, this has been painted in some ways as a border crisis, but what I would really like to draw attention to is that I think the crisis is really what's going on in Central America. There's 200,000 people that have been displaced by tropical storms or hurricanes Eta and Iota. Thousands of children run very high risks of violence in these countries, and many people are really leaving because of very desperate situations. And I think that we in the United States can welcome them. It's a logistical challenge, but I think really when we look at the factors of why people are leaving, it's for very, very complicated reasons that are usually related to poverty and violence, as well as now the exacerbating effects, the terrible situation of COVID-19 and climate change. So really there is a lot going on. These children are very desperate, and I think that we have a moral responsibility to do something about it. And I do have confidence and hope in the Biden administration that will get done.
Camila, go ahead.
Yeah, and if I can add, I agree 100% with Rachel in that this is not just an issue of, one of the things that you just said was that this is a country of immigrants, but there's also these folks at the border. We're not just a country of immigrants. We're a country who has historically said we are a country that protects those who are the most vulnerable. We're the country that welcomes and has laws like asylum laws to protect refugees and protect those who are the most vulnerable, like children, like unaccompanied children, and like refugee families. And so I'm pleased to see that the new acting director of the Department of Homeland Security is acknowledging that there needs to be something done at the border, and I hope that the country continues to go in a direction of recognizing that these are individual people who need our protection, and that we do have systems and laws in place to deal with them and to protect them.
Kenji, I talked about tens of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border. Do you have a more specific idea of where we are and where the United States is with handling the numbers, those statistics? Because it looks like the US is on record to have the highest number of migrants and asylum seekers at the border in the past 20 years. What are you seeing? What do you know?
I just wanted to note that, this is a really important shift in tone and in what the administration is saying, that it's going to respect U.S. laws and treaty commitments to refugees. But at the same time, the government isn't living up to those statements because they continue a Trump administration policy of blocking and expelling asylum seekers based on a false justification about public health. And so at the moment, we continue to see many, many asylum seekers who are unable to seek protection in the United States and who are being expelled to Mexico and to other countries. So just to give one example of a family that our researchers recently spoke to, a Haitian family who had sought asylum in the United States. They were expelled to Haiti, where they continued to face death threats and were forced to flee again. And they're now back in Mexico, in Tijuana, hoping to seek asylum, but the ports of entry, the entryways to the United States remain closed to asylum seekers. And so they're there in Mexico waiting in really grave dangers. And those are the kinds of dangers that we've seen for years and years under the policies of the last administration that returned asylum seekers to Mexico. And that's what the Biden administration, unfortunately, is continuing to do, expose asylum seekers to really awful risks of kidnapping, of rape, of torture, and worse. We've seen asylum seekers turn back to Mexico who've been murdered. And hopefully that doesn't happen again, and hopefully the administration will unwind these policies quickly to restore refugee protection. But it's really concerning to us that the Secretary of Homeland Security, the statement that you just showed, continues to say that the administration will turn away asylum seekers.
Basically, the message is we are going to kick you out unless you're a child traveling by yourself. It's a very straightforward message. Let me just share this with you. Rachel, I'm going to play Maria Castillo to you because she picks up on something that you talked about, which was climate change as a pull factor, pulling people into the United States. Let's have a listen to Maria.
The role of climate change is not being discussed enough with regard to the current situation at the border. Central America, and especially Honduras, have been badly hit by a series of once-in-a-100-year hurricanes and levels of flooding. Thousands of Central Americans have lost their homes, and over 4.6 million people have been adversely affected by Hurricanes Ida and Iota, according to the U.S. Agency for International Development. As the U.S. continues to debate how to respond to the rise in unaccompanied minors at the border, we must first fully reckon with and understand the root causes, which includes climate change. Climate change is going to force the most vulnerable communities from Central America to flee.
Rachel, go ahead.
I completely agree. And I think when we look at the context of what's going on in Central America, it's compounding situations on top of each other. So not only do you have, longstanding issues of violence and poverty and corruption, but now with these, with climate change and the dry corridor, people are facing drought, their crops are failing, and then we have these tropical storms or hurricanes or other types of events. It's leaving people in a very desperate situation where they don't necessarily have the resiliency mechanisms to be able to withstand something like this. So when a hurricane hits or when there's some sort of external event, the governments there are not necessarily prepared to respond to that type of event, and there's not the funding necessarily from the international community to respond to it either. And so many people are left with very little option but to leave where they're coming. But I think one thing I do want to mention as well with regards to unaccompanied children and families in general is that this isn't necessarily a new trend. Yes, climate change is on the rise and these types of events are only going to continue to get worse, but we've seen flows of people coming, especially children, since 2014 or before. And so really, I think it's a question of how do we start being more forward thinking in our responses? How do we plan for climate change? How do we address the changing demographics of particularly Central American, but not only Central American migration in terms of families and children coming? And I think that we need to be a little bit more forward looking and a little more, we could be more innovative, I think, in our policies.
Kenji, I want to pull on your experience and knowledge of what's happening with youngsters and unaccompanied youngsters heading towards the United States, but I'm going to do that via Jennifer Valdez. Jennifer makes this point about conditions and what it's like right now. Here she is.
The most concerning part of the current surge of unaccompanied minors is really that there's thousands of children being held now in the CBP facilities past the legal limit. You know, our clients are telling us experiences of being held in horrific conditions in frigid cold temperatures, sleeping on the floor, little access to food and water. And the reality is that this isn't new. This is something advocates have been sounding the alarms for years, yet the conditions have not changed. And we continue to hear the same stories over and over for our clients.
Kenji, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really concerning that young children are being held in these Border Patrol facilities, which are not meant to keep people for more than a few hours. These are cells, really, and children don't belong in them at all. And that's why for years, many advocates and human rights groups have been pushing for the United States to shift away from an enforcement policy, a way of looking at the border as if it were a national security issue, and to think more about this from a humanitarian lens, to treat the children and families and adults who are arriving at our borders seeking refuge as people who need protection, and not as people who should be caged or jailed and treated as threats to the United States. So, you know, the Biden administration is unfortunately not able to move children out of those facilities as quickly as they should be, but they have been taking steps. They're moving in at least the right direction to make that happen more quickly.
Let me just bring in some of our YouTube comments. Camila, I'm going to start with you. Help us answer some of these questions from our audience. Hedisham says, I just want the children and adults to be in a non-toxic place, but it's only been 100 days, referencing how long there's been a Biden administration. Camila, does that make any difference to you in the work that you're doing?
No, it does not. I hear that it's only been 100 days of the Biden administration, but this problem and the treatment of these minors has existed long before the Biden administration. I've done this work at Garrison since 2015. And since then, there are reports of children saying how awful the conditions are. And it's important to remember that these are children, these are families, these are people who clearly, very clearly can describe to me the difference between how they're treated by Customs and Border Patrol versus, for example, an unaccompanied child that gets transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. There is a stark difference. They all describe the same things, and they have for years. So while it has only been 100 days of the Biden administration, it's been much longer that children have been treated this way. I'd also like to acknowledge that the treatment of these children starts at the border. However, it doesn't end there. These children then come into the United States, and that focus on them being children and human beings continues. The problem at the border starts at the border, but then what happens to these children once they're here? What happens to these families once they're here? And so I hope another thing that the Biden administration continues to, or starts to focus more on, is not just how these individuals and human beings are treated at the border, but once they are processed, what happens? What support does the government give them? And so if the question is about, wanting the children to be in not toxic environments at the border, that sentiment should carry on throughout the lives of their case and throughout the times that they are in the United States and are deserving of protection and support.
We should also talk about why children are arriving alone, because that's the population of kids that we're talking about. This isn't kids who are with a parent or a guardian. These are kids who are by themselves. And of course, some children are forced to flee their countries on their own. And I've represented clients who were in that position where a family member had to flee and wasn't able to take all of their kids with them. And so children had to leave later on their own. But we also see the situation where families who arrive together at the border, but who've been blocked now for over a year, are so afraid of the dangers. They may have already been kidnapped once. They may be facing, really imminent threats, and they send their kids alone across the border. That's happened a lot over the past year, where families who were subjected to these policies that kept them out of the United States and forced them to wait in Mexico just were so desperate that they sent their kids alone because it was the best option they had in an impossible situation. And so that's one of the reasons why we're really pushing the Biden administration to stop this policy of blocking and expelling asylum seekers, because it does also force parents essentially to make this terrible decision that the safest thing they can do is to send their child alone to the United States.
What happens to those children? Excuse me, Camila. It's just, anyone who's got young kids or young nephews or any young members of their family, they're just trying to put themselves in these migrant shoes and just thinking, what happens to the kids? I've seen one idea that's come from the government, which is if you're working in these facilities, if you can look after the kids, it's almost like, can you be a foster carer for these kids? That seems to me like it's an emergency measure because they're all these kids by themselves.
Yeah, I mean, most kids have some family member, a relative, if not a parent, in the United States who can eventually take custody and provide care for them. And so the hope is that the administration can much more quickly move people through that system. So those kids aren't in Border Patrol facilities for very long. They go to a state licensed facility and not some giant stadium or convention center. That's also not an appropriate place for children. But the other option would be that the entire family is able to seek protection together so that separation doesn't have to happen.
Camila, go ahead. I bumped into you. Go ahead.
No worries. And I was just going to mention that, the Department of Homeland Security has within their discretion to do just that. They have the authority as it stands now to not separate families, to keep family units together, and to keep them out of detention centers, out of these makeshift, Kenji mentioned the stadiums. The government already has the authority to do that, and in our view, there is no excuse for them not to. Through the law, they can say, we are going to parole you into the country so that you can undergo your asylum proceedings and your court proceedings in a humane way with family members, with community members, with community support. And in our view, there's no reason that they should not start doing that immediately.
This is Jackie Gonzalez, Rachel. I'd love you to hear her point. I know you're going to make one as well. Hear her point, you make your point, and then make a point about Jackie Gonzalez. Because I hear the challenges, I hear the problems. I'm not hearing the solutions, and Jackie's bringing a couple. Here she is.
So often politicians use the word crisis to describe what's happening at our border. They do this to pursue their own political agenda, and they end up turning migrants seeking protection into political pawns. The truth is, we must challenge this disempowering narrative. The issue is not only in the federal domain. State and local authorities have the power and responsibility to also provide resources to this population. California is an example of a state that has done just that and also passed laws to protect the health and safety of migrants. There are also many groups doing critical work across the border to protect the rights of migrants. Ultimately, we all have a role to play in finding humane and just solutions to this challenge.
Go ahead, Rachel.
I agree with what Jackie said, and I think I'd like to just zoom out a little bit to also talk about, I've encountered many children in Northern Central American countries who do, as Kenji mentioned, have family in the United States, often parents or a direct family member. And I think when we're looking towards solutions, there's some programs that were under the Obama administration that got canceled under Trump that are now being reinstated, like one called the Central American Minors Program, which essentially allows children who have a parent who's lawfully in the United States and who meet a humanitarian protection criteria to apply for asylum and be reunited with their families without having to make the dangerous journey north, without having to go and present themselves at the border. And so this is an example of a policy that we could implement that would be helpful and protect children, particularly as children face very serious concerns when they're en route, especially if they pay a smuggler or something like that. And so this is the type of program I think we should expand upon. Under the Obama administration, it was limited in its scope, but if we could expand upon that, that is the type of solution-oriented response that looks at the problem and tries to protect children as best we can. And so I think that there are many other solutions that I'm sure Camila and Kenji have, but that's just one type of thing that the United States could do.
I would like Camila, Kenji, and you, Rachel, to help me out with some of the YouTube comments and questions that have come through because of the show that we're doing right now. Miem, this is for you, Camila. Why can't migrants legally come to this country in the first place? And Miem is suggesting that they're only after handouts. So that's a push back on the idea of this being a humanitarian situation. Camila, very speedy response back.
So first and foremost, seeking asylum is a legal right. It is the law in this country. And so asylum seekers are not breaking the law by trying to apply for asylum and trying to avail themselves of these protections. So all of the asylum seekers are trying to undergo a legal procedure that they have the right to under the laws of the United States, under the laws of multiple agencies that deal with human rights law. And so what these individuals are doing is, in a sense, legal by presenting themselves at the border and seeking these protections. That's a legal mechanism. And so that is a form of legal immigration.
Sal, let me give this... Oh, yeah, go ahead, Sal.
I just wanted to jump in very quickly and also say that asylum seekers are not entitled to practically any support whatsoever from the U.S. government. So there are no handouts for asylum seekers. The only thing they can do when they get here after they file their asylum application is wait 6 months before they can then become eligible for a work permit, which often takes many, many months to arrive. So asylum seekers get essentially no handouts. That's just not the case.
Thank you for clarifying that. Let me give this one to you, Sal, as well. Rachel, I don't want to spend the whole of the rest of our show on one comment, but I hear you. Let me just give this one to you, Kenji. Sal says there should be, for migrants and asylum seekers, there should be immediate relief, food, shelter, medical care, especially to the children, because they're already in the United States. Kenji, thoughts there about that one?
Yeah, that would be absolutely a part of a humanitarian response to refugees arriving at our border, and that's something that we think the federal government should be responsible for. Unfortunately, at the moment, or I guess luckily, there are many private groups and many religious-oriented groups, many Catholic shelters that have stepped up to provide that kind of shelter and food and medical care. But really, we think that should be part of a federal welcome for people who are seeking safety in our country. And I should mention that today is the anniversary of the Refugee Act, which is the law that created this pathway for asylum seekers to come to the United States. We've had that now for more than 40 years. So, that's an important part of protections for asylum seekers, is also treating them like human beings.
I've got 1 minute left. I'm going to give you a question in a minute. This is from Liz Rainey. This is for you, Rachel. One of the many things the US has to do is change its relationship with Latin America. Stop calling it a backyard. Rachel.
I agree. I think we need to look at Latin America and particularly civil society organizations in the region as our partners. It's welcoming to see that President Biden has this $4 billion plan to invest in the region, but I think aid is a wonderful thing to do. It's a long-term solution, and we need to look at the current situation and provide protection, because in the short term, people are going to need to leave their home countries because of the dire conditions that they're facing at home. And again, we can welcome people in the United States, but I think it is important to have a good relationship, particularly with civil society in Latin America. Absolutely.
Look at our brain trust on US immigration. So brilliant. Thank you, Kenji. Thank you, Camila. Thank you, Rachel. You can follow them here. Have a look at my laptop. Kenji on Twitter. Rachel on Twitter, Camila's organisation on Twitter, Thanks for watching. Thank you, YouTube, for your comments and your questions. Always appreciated. Femi OK, signing off from this episode of The Stream. Thanks for watching. See you next time.